Hello. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on your time zone. Welcome to my channel. My name is Ogbanje Joseph. Please subscribe to this channel, share, like, as well as drop a comment on the comment section. So, our lecture today is titled The Integration of African Economy into the World Capitalist Economy. The integration of African economy into the world capitalist economy. Now, Africa as a continent is divided into sub-Saharan and the North, and North Africa, and they are, the North African populace are basically Arabs, and they are more cohesive than the sub-Saharan African, citizens. Now, Africa, ironically, is the richest continent in the world in terms of natural resources, but it is the poorest in terms of development indices. No. Now, Africa's underdevelopment was first orchestrated, by the incorporation of their economy into the world capitalist economy. Now, the first period of this incorporation is the period of transatlantic slave trade. Now, the second was the stage of legitimate trade, while the last stage is the stage of neo-colonialism and globalization. Now, let us take it one after the other. So we're starting with, don't forget, we're looking at the integration of the African economy into the world capitalist economy. How was it done? And I said that, there are several eras or epochs that actually led to the incorporation or integration of Africa's economy into the world capitalist economy. And I said the first epoch, or the first thing that actually led Africa's economy into the world capitalist economy is what? Is transatlantic slave trade. That is number one. Number two is, legitimate trade. And then number three, which is the last one, is the stage of neocolonialism and, of course, globalization. Now, let us take them one after the other and look and start with the slave trade. Now, mercantilism is the earliest stage of capitalism. Africa were introduced, to mercantilism, which came in form of slave, which came in form of slave trade, and was first introduced to Africa by the Portuguese in the 15th century. Now, it was called the transatlantic slave trade, because according to Daniel Offiong, now this slave trade actually existed for about 400 years, and not less than 50 million able-bodied young African men and women were shipped from the shores of Africa, and for every one slave who arrived, there, we have about 5 or 6 that must have died in transit. Now, which means that about 65 to 75 million Africans died in transit. Now, let us look at the effects of slave trade on African economy. What is the effect of slave trade, on African economy? Now, slave trade affected African economy in two ways. Number one, the agile workforce, was carted away. Now, it was the strong men and women and able-bodied people that were removed from African soil and were shipped out. According to Aldo 2010, these slaves were divided according to their colors. The very black were left in the plantation in Latin America, the light in complexion, and the very fair were shipped to Europe, and the very fair became the domestic slave, while the light in complexion became the industrial slave, respectively. Okay, so those are the things. Now let us look at the second effect of slave trade on African economy. The second is slave raiding. Now, slave raiding actually became a natural, economic activity for the people to fight other community, okay, when they least expect, or when they least expected, in order to get slaves. Now, what is this slave raiding? Slave raiding was actually a process in which the Africans actually waylaid other African communities and take, those people that were conquered in such raiding as slaves. Okay, now according to Orpheum 1980, you understand, the Europeans actually kept this business going by setting up one group against another, and by that the slave trades, the slave traders were sure they would successfully keep the war going, and this in turn would bring them the needed human cargo. Now, all these were the reasons why the little industries were destabilized and disorganized in Africa. For example, University of Timbuktu used traditional tools for medical operations for over 250 years before the West discovered it. But the slave raiding destroyed all this. Okay, now it is good to also note that development and underdevelopment are two sides of a coin. While Africa is underdeveloping through all of those, cutting away of agile workforce and slave raiding, Europe was actually developing. Okay, now, while Africa, the forces that encouraged development in the West are the same forces that enforced underdevelopment in Africa. Now, the predominant economic activity during the mercantilist period was slave trade, which took, development to another dimension. So that is actually for slave trade. Now let us look at legitimate trade. Now, when it was obvious that slave trade was no longer fashionable, the legitimate trade was actually introduced. Okay, now the legitimate trade developed the underdevelopment in Africa because it restructured the productive activity in favor of the West. Now, the first stage of the legitimate trade, the first stage of the legitimate trade was actually called the mercantilist stage. And what did mercantilism do to Africa? Number one, it deepened underdevelopment of Africa. Number two, it initiated the taste for external goods. Number three, it disarticulated the African economy. Then number four, it disoriented Africa from having trade facilitation or trade integration. Okay, so that is actually the first stage of the legitimate trade. Now let us look at the second stage of legitimate trade. The second stage was actually stage that was characterized as follows. Number one, former colonialism or former colonization. Now, at the beginning of the 19th century, trade became the live wire of the global economy, which was hijacked by the Europeans. Now, this almost led to a clash among them, and in order to avoid such face-off, between November 1884 and January 1885, several European countries met at the Berlin Conference and partitioned Africa. Now, this was because African economy was the live wire of the European economy, and that led to the conflict that resulted in the Berlin Conference. Colonialism led to commodity that fulfilled the needs of the Europeans, and that led to the intensification of the underdevelopment of the African societies. Now, what are the effects of colonialism? What are the effects of colonialism? Now, number one, introduction of commodity production, in the underdeveloped society of Africa, which is basically imperialistic in nature. Okay, That is number one. Number two, deliberate policies were made, okay, to destroy African industries. Number three, it imposed unfavorable division of labor, because Africa produced primary products, to feed the industries in Europe. Then number four, Africa became the dumping ground, okay, for European products. Okay, so that is actually the second stage of colonization. And under the second stage, I said the first thing under the second stage of legitimate trade is formal colonialism. The second stage under legitimate trade, okay, is called the of course, the second thing under the second stage of legitimate trade is actually called neocolonialism. Now, what is neocolonialism? Neocolonialism is a new form of colonization where, although Africans have gotten their political independence, but they are still tied to the apron strings of the Western world. The European powers did not establish colonial states to carry out a program of political development or change, but to erect efficient and effective administrative states, for the purposes of economic exploitation. And this largely explains many of the problems faced by African nations under independence. Now, after independence, Now, according to Kwame Nkrumah was actually the first that used the theory of neocolonialism, which in his treatise, okay, he defined neocolonialism as the last stage of imperialism. And of course, he argues that all Ghanaians should seek first, the political kingdom, and everything will be added to it. But later, when his eyes actually opened, he now said that political power is the inescapable, okay, is the inescapable prerequisite to economic and social power. But it was not long before he reconverted, to economic determinism, because according to him, political independence is but a facade if economic freedom is not, possible also. Now, what are the effects of neocolonialism? Number one, it succeeded in creating comprador bourgeoisie, okay, that acted as internal colluding factor in the interest of the metropolitan bourgeoisie. That's number one. Number two effect of neocolonialism is penetration of foreign capital into the production process, which further underdeveloped the third world countries. Then number three, expatriation of profits and capital to the metropole. Then number four, African countries also were reduced to aid recipient continents. Then number five, we have their governments actually became puppets. Then number six, cultural imperialism, of course, through sports, language, and lifestyle. Thank you very much.